From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus with Paul Salem.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. This week we will be looking at the US-Russian relationship as it relates to the Middle East. This discussion will be pivoted around a meeting that was co-organized by the Middle East Institute and the National Defense University among a group of US and Russian experts and advisors in Berlin a couple of weeks ago. With me to discuss this complex relationship from Moscow in Russia, we have a participant of this dialogue, Professor Irina Zvyagelskaya. Irina is a professor and a chief researcher at the Institute of Oriental Studies in the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. Irina, thank you for being with us on the podcast.
Thank you for the invitation.
And with me as well is my colleague, Dr. Randa Slim, who is the director of the Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues Initiative at the Middle East Institute. Randa, thank you for being with us again.
Good to be with you, Paul, and good to be with Irina.
Randa, let me start with you. Tell us a bit about this meeting that happened in Berlin. What was it about? What were its goals and maybe outcomes?
This is the fourth in a series of meetings we have been having with a group of Russian colleagues. This is a group of 6 to 7 Americans, 6 to 7 Russians. They are what I call prac academics. The profile is of a former policymaker, former ambassadors we have there, but also the academics, the think tankers who are there, also approach these issues from a policy perspectives. And we have been talking mostly on Syria in the past, on the Middle East writ large, and at this meeting we have also added Yemen. And in this initiative, which as you indicated well, is co-organized with the NISA Center, which is the Near East and
South Asia
Strategic Studies Centers at NDU. I think what we are looking for is to, one, understand our shared interest, our areas of divergence when it comes to conflicts in Syria, conflicts in Yemen, and then try to see if we can identify areas where the two countries can work together. So,
thank you for that. Let me just pivot right there on the issue of interests and go to you, Irina. How do you see Russian interests in Syria, or how the Russian government sees its interests in Syria?
Well, I believe that probably the first and the most important interest is stability, the preservation of the nationhood in Syria, a nation state, and also it means that we should continue the fighting with the terrorists, but at the same time we should work out an exit strategy, which means that we all need political settlement. And there are framework for this political settlement, I mean Geneva framework, and there are also other formats which can be useful.
Let me ask, a lot has been made on and off about the naval bases that Russia has in Syria. How important are they for Russia's sort of overall view of things?
Well, I believe they are important because, as you know, we have been developing fleet, and this fleet, which has already been entering the Mediterranean, so it needs certain bases. But what I want to stress, that this base in Tartus, it doesn't change any balance in the region.
Okay, so you don't, I mean, it's important, but maybe not overwhelmingly important.
Yeah, of course. It's not just as thought of a threat for anyone.
Thank you. Randa, your comment?
Yeah, I would like to add to what Irina said in terms of shared interests between the United States and Russia, which I think came up at this meeting more than previous meetings we had, together. And that's due to the nature or the phase of the Syrian conflict. Right now, the Syrian conflict is more than ever shaped by regional international competition. And one shared interest that we both, agreed on during this meeting is we would like to prevent Syria from becoming an arena to escalate into a regional conflict or threaten the security of any of our regional ally, but also to prevent it from becoming an arena for a direct US-Russian confrontation along the river valley.
But hasn't it already, in a sense, become destabilizing for the region? Obviously, there's many refugees. There was a rise in terrorism that is now maybe a little bit on the back foot. Turkey is engaged. And a couple of weeks ago, right before the meeting, there was a big escalation between Israel and Iran. Aren't we already there, or can it be walked back, do you think?
That's the idea, is that we tested this. I mean, parties on the ground, specifically in the incident that you referred to, Iran and Israel, tested this possibility, and with the Russian intervention and maybe with US also working in the background, they walked away from it. And the idea is that we want to prevent that test from reoccurring again and then escalating, into something wider that will drag both of our countries into the fight. And that's why at the meeting we started discussing idea of red lines, that both the US and Russia need to explore certain red lines that we both think need to be in place, based on our common understanding that when regional conflict or regional parties that are involved in the Syrian conflict try to violate them, that we can step in to de-escalate the situation and prevent them from violating these red lines.
Well, Irina, let me ask you on two issues. Russia was sort of very much an engineer of the de-escalation zones that were put in place a little while ago through the Astana process, but they seem in some areas to be, to put it mildly, failing spectacularly, like in eastern Ghouta. And another issue I wanted to ask about, Moscow has good relations both with Iran and Israel. To what degree have they been able to manage or avoid the escalation that happened, or to avoid an escalation in the near future?
Well, if I may, I would rather start with the last question, because you're right, we have very good relations both with Israel and with Iran. So this understanding is important in trying to explain to both of them that there are certain red lines which should not be crossed. And as far as I understand, Russia is doing its best to prevent any confrontation between the two in the region. As far as Eastern Ghouta is concerned, the problem with de-escalation zones is that while proclaimed and established, they could not eliminate the terrorist groups like al-Nusra and others in these areas. And if you take Eastern Ghouta, for example, it's very close to Damascus, and terrorists from Eastern Ghouta, they used to shell Damascus every day practically. So it was a sort of existential struggle, and it should be stopped. But unfortunately, it's so difficult to do it, even militarily, because as far as I know, there are a lot of tunnels just below the surface, and the local population has been taken hostage by this terrorism. And that is why it's not easy to solve this issue.
Irina, let me go back a bit to the relationship with Iran. How would you describe the areas of common interest or common vision between Russia and Iran on Syria? And what are the areas that you might disagree on? And does Moscow have leverage over Tehran?
Well, as far as Syria is concerned, Iran, as you know, was fighting the ISIS terrorists hand by hand with Russia and with Hezbollah and with Syrian army. And this was the main interest, to get the terrorists out of Syria. But at the same time, I believe that there will be certain controversies between Russia and Iran in Syria, because I'm not sure that Iran is really interested in preserving the territorial integrity of Syria as we are interested in it. And I do understand that certain efforts of Iran to strengthen its positions in Syria might be not in the interest of the present government of Syria and of the other forces as well. But what I want to stress, that the importance of Iran for Russia is not concentrated on Syria only. It goes far beyond Syria. The policy of Iran is important for us also in the post-Soviet territory, first in Central Asia, in the Caucasus. So it's a very complicated issue. It's not just about Syria.
Thank you, Irina. Randa, where do you see areas of U.S.-Russian cooperation that have borne fruit in Syria? Is there any track record to say this can work?
I think the military deconfliction line is working, and it has helped in de-escalation some of the conflicts in some areas.
Do you mean the deconfliction between the U.S. and Russian forces themselves?
Exactly, between the U.S. and Russian forces themselves. I think the agreement that was struck on de-escalation in southwest Syria between the Americans and the Russians and the Jordanians pretty much is holding up. So as for the other de-escalation zones, we have discussed these in our track 2 dialogues well before it was discussed in the official arenas. I think the problem there is, and that's something we discuss in our dialogue, is the lack of enforcement mechanisms of violations by any party violating these agreements, and primarily the parties that have been violating this agreement has been the Syrian regime. And so that's a problem, and that's where I think we have not come to an agreement, is on these enforcement mechanisms and then on how to implement them and how to force parties to abide by them.
Irina, comments on that?
Well, I just can add a couple of words, because I believe that if we are talking about achievement, that the best achievement is the resolution 2254, to which Russia and the United States really contributed a lot. And as far as our failure is concerned, because there is failure as well, I believe it's a lack of trust, unfortunately. And this lack of trust also limits any enforcement mechanism which we can use or which we can think of.
I mean, Irina, there is always this question in DC when it comes to the relationship between Assad and Moscow, and how much influence does Moscow have over the regime in Syria, and how much is it willing to bring to the table. And so if you can help us elaborate this from your vantage point.
Well, I believe that it's not so easy to use leverage upon the regime, because the regime has its own goals, its own strategies, and I cannot say that everything the regime is doing can coincide with what Russia is doing. Our interests are not identical. But at the same time, what Russia can do and wants to do is to deliver this government to the negotiation table. But very much, of course, will depend on the response from the side of the opposition, whether they really feel responsibility for the fate of their country and whether they are ready to start negotiations.
Randa, do you see any hope in the Geneva process? There's been parallel tracks like Astana, there was a Sochi conference. Is Geneva or a real political process still a reality?
Look, it takes two parties to tango. And the mediator is as effective as the interests of the parties are in reaching a negotiation. I think it's unfair to compare the opposition that comes to Geneva with the regime. The power equation in that relationship is definitely skewed in favor of Assad. And so far, the regime has shown zero interest in serious negotiations. They show up to Geneva, but so far, they have refused to sit, in the same room with the opposition in terms of the demands, in terms of delivery of humanitarian assistance as a goodwill measure. The regime has refused, and we have seen that in Ghouta, how difficult it has been to get even few convoys in, and then the convoys that get in, they try to take 70% of the surgical instruments and equipments and drugs that are in this convoy. So I see that it's going to be hard for Geneva to succeed as long as the regime in Syria feels that the trajectory of conflict is in its favor and that it's winning, and that why concede or why make any significant concession at the table right now to the opposition when it believes that it can win this conflict militarily.
Well, in the time remaining, I want to pivot to Yemen. Yemen was the other crisis country that we discussed in this Berlin meeting. Obviously, a very complex situation there and a horrific humanitarian situation. Let me start with you, Irina. Russia certainly doesn't have the same direct sort of interests and so on in Yemen, but how would you describe, the Russian interests or view or engagement in Yemen?
Well, you know that speaking from the historical perspective, Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time, has been very much engaged in Yemen. And I believe that, again, as far as Yemen is concerned, it's our idea, like the idea of all others, to stop hostilities. Because what's going on, I mean, the intervention of Saudi Arabia, and I mean, the intervention of Iran and other forces, the problem is whether Yemen remains as a single state. And now it's more and more problematic. And what is also more problematic, whether it will really be stabilized. And what will we do with the humanitarian situation, which is just awful. There is a real tragedy going on, and unfortunately not many people and not many countries really pay enough attention to this tragedy.
Certainly in the discussions in Berlin, Randa, it was clear that among the Russian and American participants, there was much more of a sense of common vision or common interest vis-a-vis Yemen, especially when compared to Syria. How do you see that, and do you think that is meaningful, that it might lead to something?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And take away from the Berlin meeting is that while Russia is interested in having a role or in contributing to the resolution of the conflict in Yemen, it doesn't have the bandwidth, or it doesn't assign the same priority to it, because Syria and the conflict in Syria and its intervention in Syria has consumed pretty much most of its military and diplomatic bandwidth in the Middle East. But at the same time, Russia and the United States have been pretty much on the same page when it comes to the resolution of the Yemen conflict, in terms of supporting the UN-led mediation process, in terms of preserving territorial integrity of Yemen, and in terms of fighting Al-Qaeda and ISIL in Yemen. And so there is much more hope for continuing this collaboration, which has always been in place between the US and Russia when it comes to Yemen.
Irina, let me ask a broader question. You are sitting in Moscow. Many people here in the US and maybe around the world are trying to figure out the US-Russian relationship, particularly under this administration. Maybe I will limit our discussion to how it manifests towards the Middle East. But from your vantage point, do you think that the leadership in Russia at the end of the day wants to be an adversary to the US, for example, in the Middle East, like in the old days? Or is it looking for opportunities for cooperation and building a useful relationship? Are they happy with the conflict, or would they like to be in a different place?
No, I'm absolutely sure that the idea is that of cooperation. Unfortunately, it's not working very well with the present administration. I believe there are domestic reasons, but anyway, it's your business. You can better describe it. But as far as the policy of Moscow is concerned, even the last speech of Putin, which you followed, I'm sure, it proved that the idea was enough is enough. Let's start negotiations. Let's do something together, because very much depends on our two powers in this world. So as far as the Middle East is concerned, you remember the idea behind Russian moves there was to restart certain collaboration with the United States in the area where it looked very possible, because we had a common enemy. But even in Syria and in other places in the Middle East, it turned out to be very difficult. So I still do hope that with this channel, which we have with the Middle East Institute, and I'm grateful to the Middle East Institute and NISA that they really managed to establish this channel, we still will have more opportunities for exchange and probably for recommendations, which will be useful for both governments in the United States and in Russia.
Thank you, Irina. Randa, the last word is for you. You lead this Track 2 initiative. Where do you see this going from here? What do you see coming out of this process?
I think we would like to continue what we have been doing in terms of exploring these areas of shared interest and, delve more deeper into the remaining areas of divergence that the two countries have in conflicts in the Middle East, particularly Yemen and Syria, and try to see how much we can push, toward more common interest and more shared interest. And I totally agree with Irina, is that In Syria, Russia today is an indispensable player when it comes to finding a resolution of the conflict, and that we have an interest, the Americans have an interest in finding a political settlement to the conflict. And so we need to continue this dialogue with the Russians in track 2 like we do, as well as in official diplomacy, to try to keep moving this conflict out some kind of a resolution, whether it's in Geneva, if it can be sustained, or somewhere else, and end this humanitarian tragedy that we see unfold every day on our TV screens and on our social media platforms.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to thank both my guests, Randa Slim. Thank you for being with us, Director of our Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues Initiatives. Thank you, Randa, for being with us.
Thank you.
And a very big thank you to Professor Irina Zvyagelskaya, who joined us by Skype from Moscow today. Irina, thank you very much for joining us, and hope to see you again
Thank
soon.
you both, Paul. Thank you, and Randa, thank you very much.
Thank you, Irina. Pleasure to be with you.
And thank you to all our listeners for following this podcast today. If you want to join the conversation, you can go to our Facebook page. But otherwise, stay tuned for further podcasts, and we will see you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.